All right, guys, we'll go ahead and get started. Got a lot of information to cover. All right, so the second segment of Exploring Encounters, a ufology seminar, deals with Texas UFO history. I am a native Texan. I've lived in the Dallas-Fort Worth area my whole life, but I've been coming down here to the valley for the last 10 years. I actually met Noe in 2015 at another event, but he, at that event, told me about this one, or at least the one here in Edinburgh, and so I got together. So I've been coming down since 2015. It's hard to think it's already been a whole decade, but I'm really glad to see that not only is there a local group, or at least a contingent of people here interested in keeping the interest going, having meetings more frequently than just the annual festival, but that here in the area we can actually do something to kind of let people know that we're open-minded and exploring the mysteries of not just UFOs, but all these interesting topics, but that we can have ways to take it seriously. If people do have things they'd like to report, you can do that with MUFON and the local group here, MUFON 956. And there's a lot of ways to stay connected. There's social media and all this other stuff, right? Well, if you see anything you're interested in on this presentation, again, there will be QR codes, or if you have anything you're wondering about, would like to ask or tell me, we can do that as well. So, Texas UFO history. This really is something that I'm going to dedicate towards very specific cases. Obviously, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of UFO sightings all over the world. Here in Texas, we have a large state, and there's a lot more people than most other states. So by proxy, there are more sightings. But from that, you can deduct that not all those sightings are reported. Actually, very few people probably report their sightings, and many people don't know where to do that if they even knew that they could. But it's important that we can let people know that, yeah, you can report sightings, you can call the cops and let them know, but they're just going to say, okay, and hang up. But if they know that there's a MUFON group, they might be able to put MUFON on speed dial and say, hey, let's let someone know. It doesn't have to just be MUFON. It could be a way that we can go on, like the Texas UFO Network, and show that, okay, I saw something, I don't know what it is. A good example is that people on the Texas UFO Network, and this will keep happening for years, but they'll post videos of Starlink, or what they don't know at the time to be Starlink, several lights in the sky moving in a chain line all the way across. People will see that, not knowing what Starlink is, and share about it. And now that we know, we can let people know that, hey, we were tracking the launch, it was a Falcon launch, or if it was this or that, here's how we can actually determine what some of those things are. So there are ways to make sure that we're just looking into following up with reports. And it's not always just about, well, I saw something weird and that was it, although sometimes that's all it can be, right? But we can look back over a century into the recorded and documented sightings that weren't always referred to as UFOs, but give us an indication that people were seeing things wherever they were, but specifically in the sky, for a number of years before we had the terminology UFO to use to kind of have an umbrella term to work with. But going back many, many years, and Noah's written extensively about many of these cases as well, that we have an interesting story in Dallas, Texas. I found the original article in the Dallas Herald. This was later repeated in the Denison Daily News of a farmer named John Martin. And basically, he describes seeing an object which was the size of an orange and then came down closer to the size of a large saucer. So, as I mentioned, we had the term flying saucer because of Kenneth Arnold in 1947, in June of 1947. He's talking about seeing these 9 crescent-shaped objects moving like a saucer, which got spun into flying saucers by the media. And so now this idea of saucers is relating to UFOs since the late 40s. Now it's just a trope that we use to kind of talk about aliens and weird stuff. But we can claim stake here in Texas to have used the term saucer in regard to what we call now UFOs well before Kenneth Arnold's sighting back in 1878, which is really impressive that this was a news article back then. And if you're interested, this can be found on the newspapers.com. It's an invaluable resource. I use it all the time. And really cool to see that we continue on in finding old reports like that when we dig deeper into the past. This is a really cool place with some interesting phenomena. How many of you guys have ever been to Marfa, Texas? Cool, a lot. Actually, that's awesome. Now, people have described seeing mystery lights, some strange light phenomenon in Marfa, Texas for many years. But what we do know is the earliest recorded history of sightings was in 1883 by a man named Robert Reed Ellison, who thought that they were Apache fires and wanted to ride out and go find them. The Apache Indians actually said that they thought that these fires were sort of ghost fires, but people that go out there, when they get close, they can't seem to find them. They're only somehow visible from far away and at night. Now, I don't know if that means that they're not there during the day or what they are exactly is still very much up in the air, but it's out in a place called Mitchell Flat. And there are several signs out there today which you can go to. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on too. A little bit further, in the late 1800s, 1896 and specifically into 1897, we have what we call the Great Airship Mystery, or what the Dallas Morning News calls the Great Aerial Wonder, which on the 5th page of the April 19th edition has over a dozen stories of what they call the airship. Now, this was also seen all throughout California and the Midwest. People were suspecting inventors to be the ones behind these strange vessels that were like dirigibles or blimps up in the sky at a time when there was not supposed to be anything. It's before modern aviation. It's 6 years before the Wright brothers had the flyer out of Kittiawah, Nebraska. And it gives us the impression that people were seeing something, and that perhaps many of these were tabloid papers written for the purpose of generating interest to sell the papers. And we know that that happens. That does happen even now. But I think that there were too many concentrated reports over specific times, over specific areas, that should maybe give us a clue that, if 100 or 200 or 500 airship stories were fake, it only takes that one for there to be a legitimate, strange, unknown occurrence. And I think that can be said with a lot. Now, it doesn't all come down to that, but it just shows that this isn't just one story of an airship. There are several hundreds of airship stories at this time frame. April of 1897 was the busiest. And I should say also that people from the late 40s, specifically the 50s and on into the 60s, with Blue Book and all these other investigative efforts by civilians and others, we find out that this subject really started to get more notoriety, especially in the late 60s and into the 70s, and you have groups like MUFON at that point. Well, one of the things people often forget is that before we have a name like UFO to attribute to this, people kind of group them into different areas of interest, whether they thought of it as spiritualism or mysticism. Well, another word is the 4TN, which is about Charles Fort. Charles Fort was interested in all these types of things, and he's probably one of the original UFO investigators. He was writing about the airships in the 20s. He wrote a book called The Book of the Damned in 1919, and then subsequently the following year wrote New Lands, which was all about looking into the airships of the 1800s. And it was before people were saying UFO. So, it just goes to show that depending on the context, we have to look into these things through different lenses. If we've got UFOs on the brain, we're going to only see UFOs. You have to sometimes find what's culturally relevant and in the respective time frames to be able to look into this stuff. My interest in this lies within a very specific case within Aurora, Texas, which is near where I'm from, because I think it's probably the most notable of the airship stories. Not only is it a story about a sighting of an airship, but it deals with the subsequent crash of this ship into a local farmer's windmill, water tank, and well. Not only was there a crash with wrecked material, apparently scattered over acres, but the subsequent burial of the occupant or pilot, which was claimed to have been the only one on board. Enough of the remains were found to determine that it was not an inhabitant of this world, according to the newspaper article. Here it is, and I think that, as these are all very sensational claims, and if you take it at literal value and face value, that would be one of the most incredible UFO stories, even by today's standards. The irony is that we hear government talking about crashed UFOs, retrievals, materials, biologics. This story has all of that over 100 years ago. Even if we say this whole story was a hoax and made up and people were just trying to sell papers, it at least inspires the idea that this is not a new consideration. Like, everything that we're talking about in government and Congress now is something that people were aware of the possibility of, if not anything else, over a century ago. And I'll just say that, the people mentioned in this article are real people. I've tracked them down. They're obviously not alive, but so far removed that there are maybe relatives of relatives. But Samuel Edwin Hayden moved away from Aurora not long after this article was written. And I found where his grave is in California, and I'm hoping to go there just to be able to document the historicity of this story is folklore. But he talks about a James Smith Proctor and a Thomas Jefferson Weems. I found Thomas Jefferson Weems, T.J. Weems, he's the one who made the claim about the occupant being from Mars and not an inhabitant of this world, which is what sets this story apart from the other airships, because all the other ones generally deal with a strange vessel that seems to have more or less human inventor occupants, if they do at all, whereas this one seems to be a little bit more otherworldly in origin. There's probably the only picture ever of Hayden, and it's one that is before this story was written. He was a cotton trader and was considered that he wrote this paper to draw in tourism, to revive a dying town. But, you know, that's just one of the things that people interpret about the story. We'll revisit that later on as well. Many, many years later, in the 1940s, and there are other interesting sightings and things throughout the teens, 20s and 30s, just not a lot, because people weren't thinking UFOs at the time. But, you know, Noe's done a great job of chronicling a lot of the earlier, lesser-known reports during those early years of the 1900s. Well, in the 40s, this is, again, one of the earliest known recording documented efforts made to report what we call the Saratoga Light. Another weird light phenomenon. It's not a nuts and bolts craft way up in the sky. It's some 8-mile stretch of road north of Houston in Saratoga that people see what they call the ghost light. This is Ghost Road, and it's something that people go to kind of get out of town and go hang out, even today. But people describe seeing a mystery light, and I think people see car headlights and can mistake those for anything, but perhaps there is a genuine light. That happens at Marfa anyways. People see the car headlights, and there are cars, and they mistake them as the Marfa lights, but there are genuine mystery lights out there that we're seeing, and are still seen now, but we're seeing before there were even cars out there. So this makes us wonder, you know, what are people seeing? But people often attribute the Saratoga light to more of a paranormal, haunted type of activity. Touching back to Aurora in 46, a new family moved onto the Proctor property that had the farm with the windmill, and they wanted to use that well that had the debris that crashed into the windmill and the water tank and all this. The Oates family moved onto Proctor's family farm property and wanted to basically revitalize the well for drinking and redid it all. And starting in 1945 and specifically 46, the Oates family started to do that. Brawley and Bonnie Oates and their sons and their family and their children started to do that at that time frame, and basically that's a key marker at that time where they started using the water. And then we talked about Roswell already. The relevance why it's in this Texas history presentation is because, as I mentioned earlier, you can see the relation. It's about the same distance from here to DFW. It's like 500 miles almost due west. And so there we have the original newspaper, and then we have these pictures of General Roger Ramey and Jesse Marcel posing with what looks like tinfoil or aluminum foil. You guys have probably seen these pictures before. These were taken in Fort Worth at the Carswell Army Airfield, which is now a Joint Naval Reserve. But you know, it makes us wonder. These were shown to the press to get something to be released. And also people considered that there was this note in General Ramey's hand that talks about flying discs being recovered and taken to Fort Worth. People also considered that the debris or something was taken to Wright-Patterson in Ohio, and that very well could be likely, because that's often, in the lore of ufology, seems to be a prime indicator of where things are taken. So people wonder what that note says. This is a blown up from my phone, but people are trying to do what they can to interpret what this memo actually says. It apparently has a quote of a flying disc in there. I mentioned about the article I wrote, and I hope that you guys can go check out Roswell into the 50s. Now this is a complicated issue because it's been contested by a number of people, but I've seen that other people are in support of this story as well. I was introduced to this story by Noe Torres here and his partner in research and co-author Ruben Uriarte and their book The Other Roswell. Now, what's really important to mention is that this is a story about a man who came forward to tell about an encounter he had while up in a flying wing formation, and described, while in formation, seeing an object coming down. This is flying through Texas, and it turned and started to go south towards Mexico. As this object went, Colonel Robert Willingham requested permission to pursue the object from his commanding officer, which he got, followed it all the way through the Texas-Mexico border, where he saw its object crash. He later came back in a private plane with a secondary person to have as a witness, and then at that point saw several people barricading the wreckage, and they landed, got out, which I think is super impressive to be able to land on not a runway or strip, and described this object being crashed into a hill, a crack in the hull of the object. He noticed debris scattered everywhere, and basically pocketed some of it, and looked into the crack of the hull, describing what he could see were beings, but not people like us, and had broomstick-like arms, very weird people inside. He pocketed some of that metal and later went to try to tamper with it, and it was very weird. So this is kind of a close encounter of the third kind, crash retrieval. Many years later, Coast to Coast AM had Dr. Eric Davis, who I showed a picture of in the previous presentation, and Dr. Eric Davis says that this was a real retrieval. Other people have said that this was a hoax and that he made all this up. We don't really know, but it's one of those things that I think is important to keep in mind. That it's one of those stories that we had him come forward to kind of share about that with us for a moment. So I'm going to move on. Oh yeah, then we had the Del Rio Festival. That went on until the Air Force shut it down. The following year, in 2016, I got to go out there there we are, Noe, and then Ruben, Gary Holloway, his dad. We flew a drone over. We flew a drone over that one and tried to see where the original location might have been, and it looks like that could have been it. As far as where he landed and crashed into a hill, kind of hard to say. Yeah, and so I'm going to leave you guys with that for just a moment. We're going to start on this one. And be right back, guys.
Sí, que se paró.
I just gotta run over to ATV and come right back. Okay. Sweaty. Okay. And my wife. Let's just call it this. Just a little bad. Plus I have coolers.
Are you guys still hearing me okay? Yes. Cool, thank you. Okay, we're going to keep moving on here. Okay, so in 1951, we have a pretty famous UFO sighting here in Texas called the Lubbock Lights incident. These are actual photographs of whatever those Lubbock Lights were. This was also investigated by Project Blue Book, which I mentioned was the Air Force's investigation in the late 50s and 60s. The determination on these was that they are birds, plover birds, reflecting lamppost lights from about 2 miles away. Now, there are a lot of people who thought that these could be individual objects, or as you can see, a whole formation. And these were taken by scientists at the technical college there. So the Lubbock Lights is a pretty historical incident. There's an episode on the fictionalized History Channel show Project Blue Book. I think it's season 1, episode 3. You can check out. It's all about this. It's kind of a fun, fictitious portrayal. It also kind of uses Dr. Hynek as a main character if you've never seen that show. But yeah, Lubbock Lights is actually a really interesting, similar case to maybe the Phoenix Lights as far as the formation and how we had all these different lights. And it was also described to be like a mothership waiting for all the other smaller lights. There's sideways, again, plover birds, potentially. Not impossible, I guess, but very out there explanation. 53, this is an interesting case that not a lot of people consider or know about because it's not your nuts and bolts UFO. But in Houston, Texas, the Chronicle reports an unearthly Batman that terrifies watchers. This is a really interesting case where people who were in Houston Heights at the time were looking outside, and there was a strange glowing form in the yard that ascended up into the tree line. This turned out to be what looked like a person in a paratrooper outfit that had black wings unfurled and was wearing this weird mask, a paratrooper type outfit. And then later, something rocketed up in the sky down the road. This is approximately the location where it would have happened, and obviously there's a highway there now, I think it's I-10. But they reported this, and the newspaper carried it. And now it just gets repeated and people look into it. But this is probably where it would have happened in the Houston Heights area of Houston. Moving on, in 57, we have a really weird UFO case in Levelland, Texas that looks like it was an egg-shaped object. This descended down, it was affecting vehicles. Law enforcement also saw this and got many calls. Some vehicles were basically shut down and disabled until the object left. Now, there's a lot of buzz about UFO-shaped objects here recently, but this is nothing new. As we can see, many people have been describing a multitude of morphology when it comes to the orientation or shape of these objects. My buddy Nate Riddle wrote about this and many others in his book, Lone Star Saucers, and it's one that he also gave a presentation of at our local DFW MUFON group as well. Kevin Rendell, who's authored a number of books on Roswell, wrote one on Levelland too, so you can check that out there. In 57, a few years later, as I mentioned, the Oates family, who moved onto the Proctor property there in Aurora, Texas, they wanted to use that water, so they drank from it and used it from the well for 12 years until 1957. They decided to slab it and put a slab on it and basically seal it up. There you can see it says Oates 1957. And after 12 years of use, they decided that they were done, that it wasn't working out, and apparently they described it causing them some health conditions, which we'll get into. In 63, I include this because we should all know the tragic events that struck our nation, and specifically here in Dallas, Texas, where President John F. Kennedy was killed and assassinated in public. Now, people can have all their different ideas about what happened that day, why it happened, and who it happened with. But I bring this up because just 10 days prior, I put 12, it's actually 10 days prior, President Kennedy was requesting to the director of the CIA all information about UFOs be turned over. And I'm not insinuating that this is why he was killed. There were probably a number of reasons why he was. And I just think it's important to share the relevance of this in relation to that having happened in Dallas. Just a few days prior, he was asking about UFOs. In this document here, so very, very curious. In 66, of course, one of the reasons we're all here is because, and thanks to Noe Torres here to let us know about a strange incident in 1966 where 8 construction workers came to work at a caliche pit for mining and had equipment, and unfortunately, they were all struck with some calamity that entered into the sky, airspace around. There was noise, there was lights, and it seemed to be something that damaged their equipment and their structures to the point that they phoned the sheriff, who later responded to coming out the next day with his son So the sheriff Milo Ponce and his son Joe Ponce, who was a boy at the time, came out. Now there's the idea that there was a record made of this interaction, and that these 8 people who came down from Dallas had some kind of documentation. That has somewhat disappeared. It sounds like there would be some real challenges to figuring out who those people were, because once they left, we don't really have a record of them until that gets found. But we do have Joe Ponce, who describes seeing the wreckage as a boy. He's a witness to those claims that basically something was damaged. He didn't see the object himself, but subsequently the aftermath or effects, a CE2 perhaps, where something was affected by. We don't know if those people were affected by the object. They could be alive and well. They could have been, succumbed to radiation. We don't really know the outcome because it's hard to follow up. This is a very similar story to Travis Walton, except in that situation, they're all still around for the most part, and are still in agreement about what happened. And I think what's also interesting, that got turned into a story with a movie called Fire in the Sky. Noe wrote a book in parallel to that called Fire from the Sky about this incident, because it used to be something he was fortunate enough to shed light on in a way that now we do know about these long forgotten cases, thanks to Noe and people who are taking the time to research this in a way that we can learn about some of our lost history. And so you can go to the festival, of course, and the conference is a great opportunity to connect with like-minded individuals as well. Here we are last year going out to the site and the location where this is all supposed to have happened. Now obviously it looks much different. It looks very crater-like. That is not a product of what happened. That was later done to be built up with the land there, but just kind of a strange, similar setting you can see in a lot of other types of instances where something is affecting the land. We actually have gone out there and looked around and done readings to see if there is anything tangible that has something left. Again, several years later, it's hard to find certain things, but it does promote for people to go and be on site to look at what it would have been like for these people to have been in that location. And of course, Fire from the Sky is available from Noe Torres, and it's an interesting collection of that story specifically. And definitely check out the festival and conference, and we're looking forward to new developments. Coming back to Aurora, I'll just say over the next decade, from 66 to 76, Aurora has just swept the nation with news headlines. It was dormant. The Aurora story, unless it was being discussed by local people in town, there in Aurora or Wise County, Texas, no one was publishing anything about this anywhere that I've located at all up until 1966, wherein certain people came forward, scientists came out to research. Even Dr. Heineck was interested in coming out. While he himself wasn't able to, he sent someone on his behalf to go investigate the Aurora legend. And so I think it's interesting to see, because all throughout the 70s you have tons of newspaper articles all over the nation, and books being written, magazines, even history books that were written for the purposes of being able to address some of those challenges. My buddy, the late, great Jim Mars, before he was well known for his contributions as an author and on television and many shows, he was a writer for my local newspaper, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, where he wrote about these things, the UFO crash site and the pilot and the Christian burial. And so he was on location in the 70s when various groups like MUFON and other people came out to investigate. Metal had been found and studied. This is Dr. Tom Gray of UNT, at the time North Texas State University, analyzing the samples, finding that there were high traces of aluminum and zinc, which was very unusual that something like that kind of aluminum would have been available before 1933. So people consider that this could be an oddity, or that a lot of the metal found was very much prosaic and not like anomalous in any way. There is Bill Case, who was an aviation writer for the Dallas Morning Herald, and he was also part of MUFON. I think he was the state director, but he was there writing about it all the time, getting it in the newspaper like every week, which got a lot of attention. And also people like Hayden Hughes of the International UFO Bureau came from Oklahoma to investigate and actually sought ways to legally exhume the alleged grave site. And this is important because out of everything that I've shared about with Aurora, the number one thing I get asked at like any event or anything when I'm talking about is, why don't they just dig it up and just put this all to rest? Well, yeah, people thought about that literally half a century ago in 1973. And this man and his group tried to, and the Cemetery Association just threatened him with an injunction and said, we're going to put a lawsuit on anyone who comes digging. So they put a cemetery watch up, and they prevented people from water people from entering in. Subsequently, this man, Brawley Oates, as I mentioned earlier, came forward and said, I've been drinking that well water for 12 years, and now I have these really bad injuries and health conditions. And he thought, apparently, that it was due to drinking that irradiated water that spaceship crashed affected. I don't think there are any medical records to substantiate those claims, but it is interesting how we see that people are affected by being in close proximity to anomalous phenomena. So, interesting to see how that happened to him, whatever did happen. And there are pictures of what we call the original grave, if it was ever there originally or if it was put into place. That has been debated, but it seems like some people indicate that this was there for a number of years. And that this picture here shows that it's like a small, crude rock, not a fine marble gravestone. I got these pictures from Jim Mars, that he was there on site during that time frame, and he shows that what looks like he suspected was a half of a full stone that made this depiction of an inscription that showed maybe a full UFO shape on there. He was pretty creative, I'll give him that, but we don't know what happened to this. Some people consider it still around, but it was stolen soon after that cemetery watch in June 1973. In 76, the Texas Historical Mission worked with the Wise County Historical Society after a manuscript was submitted to erect a marker commemorating the town's history along with the legend of the spaceship crash, which I mentioned earlier. You can go see that today. It's pretty cool to see that you have a historical marker, an official marker talking about a spaceship crash and the pilot from 1897. In 76, we have an interesting sighting of large unknown flying creatures. These aren't UFOs in the typical nuts and bolts sense, but here in the valley, many people in Brownsville and Raymondville, and even up all the way to San Antonio, and school teachers were reporting seeing strange creatures that had leathery-like wings and seemed to be something to the effect of a pterodactyl. This is a pretty wild claim since pterodactyls are supposed to have been extinct for millions of years, but these people were assured of what they had seen with the cooperation of other witness claims. And sometimes when I've been here at the Edinburgh event, and I bring this up, I'll have people tell me, I saw it too. I know that saw it too. So the Big Bird phenomenon is a really interesting cryptid of cryptozoology, but by way of proxy, it is also a UFO because it's an unidentified flying object. It's a creature, but it's not necessarily a spaceship or a craft, right? So sometimes people see creatures they don't identify. We don't know what these creatures were. We can only hope that maybe they're still around, some of them. There's my buddy and colleague, the world-renowned cryptozoologist Ken Gerhardt. Ken was a presenter at the Edinburgh conference a few years back, where he presented on his first book about the cryptid, Big Bird, and really interesting opportunity to kind of blend some of those things together, cryptozoology with ufology. Moving on, in 1980, we have a really tragic and somewhat unfortunate circumstance of a case in Dayton, Texas. This is December 29th. December 29th, Betty Cash, Vicki Landrum, and her grandson Colby Landrum were driving down a back road after trying to go out, and were headed back home and essentially saw a large glowing diamond-shaped object descending down from the sky, surrounded by nearly 24 military helicopters, some of them black, double rotors, and this object fell down and went right over the road and was shooting down light or even fire over the road, destroying it, preventing them from going around, and it disabled their vehicle. They got out, they could feel an immense searing heat. Before they really got to this point, the boy, Colby Landrum, asked his grandmother, Vicki Landrum, "What is that?" Which she responded, "That's Jesus. This is the second coming." And unfortunately, it wasn't, and they got badly irradiated. Eventually, the whole envoy went off, and they were able to drive back, and the next day they were terribly sick, hair falling out, blisters, throwing up, obvious signs of some kind of really nasty radiation poisoning. They actually tried to sue the Air Force, but to no avail. And they at no point thought that this was extraterrestrial. They thought, probably because of the association of the helicopters, that this was some kind of military experimental aircraft, although other people later on have kind of commented on this whole story saying that, oh, this could be this kind of thing, or it could be an alien reproduction vehicle, or reverse engineered. We don't know. That's all very sensational because there's no way for us to really know until more comes forward. But John Schuessler of MUFON wrote this book on it. There were several investigations done. That road had been cleaned up by some clandestine cleanup crew. So someone knows about what happened here. And we don't know the people, the personnel involved with this and that operation of whatever is happening were probably as affected by it as the Colby and the Landrums. So it's too bad what happened to them. Colby is still alive, but the two ladies aren't. Here I am on the scene at the location. It's near Huffman, Texas. This is where this happened. So you can imagine a giant diamond burning down into the ground, fire from the bottom of this thing. Very weird. We don't see many square or diamond-shaped aircraft or drones. So what was that thing? Makes us wonder. But there are UFO reports of similar shapes. Also in '86, a movie was made about the Aurora encounter. And it's kind of a fun B film. I actually found it in the wild on VHS. I never thought that would happen. But it stars Jack Elam and Donnie West and then a boy with progeria named Mickey Hayes. And I learned this from Noe that he actually was part of a Make-A-Wish Foundation that allowed him to play the alien, or the spaceman as they sometimes call him, because he's misshapen. People thought it might be weird that they made him play this alien because of how he looks. But actually, that was what he wanted, and he got to do it. And he unfortunately passed away a few years later. I found a movie poster, a theatrical release vintage poster, and when I got it, I didn't know this, but I looked a little bit closer, and it actually has some writing, and I found out that that's Mickey's signature. So he signed this poster, and I thought that was pretty cool because he wasn't around much after that. Moving on, in 1988, the Texas Historical Commission also erects a marker in Marfa, acknowledging the unexplained phenomenon, which is pretty cool. They also refer to the ghost lights, which you can go see there at what they have now for 20 years, basically, is this viewing center, viewing area, 24-hour rest stop, and a lot of cool signage, thanks to the Texas Department of Transportation, along with some of the school systems there. They were able to erect this really cool facility, which is a little bit off the ground, which you can see now for miles out into Mitchell Flat. They have binoculars and kind of viewing little spaces there. I've seen the lights, or what I interpreted as the Marfa lights, a few times. This top row was 4 lights all moving in perfect synchronicity, fading in and out. This middle one was one that turned into 2, kind of split apart. And this bottom one here is one light that I exposed over about a minute of video that seemed to be changing colors every few seconds. So I don't know if this is a product of my camera's ability or inability perhaps to interpret the light frequencies, or if they actually have a core inner part, or what this is, but those lights are very interesting. I don't know if they're alien spaceships, I don't think so, but I don't know if they are a residual phenomenon or if they are an interactive phenomenon where you can actually do something and they respond differently. Many people consider that this is a residual phenomenon and a product of something similar to piezoelectricity due to tectonic plating and maybe gases and things within the mineral deposits in the ground. That's all brilliant. If that's the case, that's still very interesting. If this is just a geophysical phenomenon that's not in any way alien, that just goes to show there's still a lot we can learn. And if people say that this is just car headlights creating a refraction or something, why aren't we seeing that everywhere else in the Southwest? Why only in Marfa or in some other very rare places? So I think that there could be something to the Marfa lights as far as helping us to really push the boundaries of what we can find out that's still here in our world. This isn't just a one-time sighting. You can go to Marfa tonight and probably see these lights. There's no consistency as to how often they're seen, but it's not just someone saw it one time and that was it. So I think that's what makes these an interesting phenomenon to go and check out.
Daniel, I just wanted to add that we went out there with the Laredo Paranormal Society with Chris James's buddies, and they fired handheld lasers at the Marfa lights. And we saw a definite reaction. Sometimes they would move left or right of where the laser beam was hitting, and sometimes they seemed to split into 2, leaving the laser in the middle, in the blank space in the middle. So it was very interesting to see what looked to us, and of course we were judging with our own senses, and there's no scientific data here, but it seemed that they were reacting to those handheld lasers every time they struck one of them.
That, I think, is a hopeful sign that maybe they are interactive and there is some sentience or intelligence behind what they are or what they represent, because that would be a game changer. If they're just a product of something causing a light to show up, that's cool. But if they are actually able to have some agency and respond to their environment, that could allow us to identify that it's not that we're not alone in the universe, but maybe there's something else here in our own world that we're still able to discover and be able to kind of
There's
say,
also
let's go to it.
there's also been numerous accounts, as I've researched the Marfa lights. There's numerous accounts of people who encounter the lights close up. They chase their vehicle. They encountered them in the desert, and it descends down close to them. So there seems, some of those stories lead us to believe that there's a sentience there. We don't know.
Right, and I quoted on the other one that it said that you can only see them from far away, but I should, as a qualifier, you're right, there are several reports of people seeing them up close and going way over their cars and things, and I think that makes me wonder, if they're all in that area for so long and then things make them do something different, what can cause that? And so I do think it's worth looking into, and it's not just a historical case. We could go out there with a team or whoever just to enjoy it, or we can have a serious effort put forward to try to figure it out. So I think it's kind of weird that hasn't happened in the last, 5 to 10 years. I mean, some schools go out every once in a while, but a real effort made to try to determine what these things are. So very interesting. A little bit more recently, the Stephenville UFO incident was a huge issue. It got national media attention, and people still see things there today. This is a case that got my interest. I had been out of high school for a year or so, and I caught wind of this, and I was interested in finding out about the local people in my area that might know something, and I got involved with groups, and that's eventually what led me to meeting Jim Mars and working with this man, Ken Cherry, who was the state director of MUFON at the time, and lead investigator, along with Steve Hudgens and many other people, to look into this. He was on the news, they held a press conference. Basically, people saw this thing that was like a flying Walmart. He wrote a book on it under the guise of fiction to include things that he otherwise doesn't think he could have. So he's very careful, but this object, whatever was seen, was enormous and flying effortlessly from horizon to horizon, when it was also being pursued by F-16s, up to 12 F-16s, which was originally denied. It was tracked on radar, and this is considered a flap, which is an enormous sight. It wasn't just one person, it was like a town full of people, you have law enforcement. Many people saw this, and we continue to for a while. So the Stephenville UFO is an important one because it has a lot of traction with a large amount of people, large-scale sighting, hard data, lot to it. For the first time ever, the merchants there at the downtown merchants, kind of like their Chamber of Commerce, put together an ET Festiville, play on the name. And it's not a big full-scale conference like what we have in Edinburgh or anything, but it was kind of a fun attempt, first ever, at doing something. Here I am with my brother Matthew and our buddy Chase. And it's just one of those things I hope that they maybe can keep it going. From here on, Aurora started to utilize the imagery associated with its legend and their marketing and branding. You can see a windmill and a flying saucer, which was not what was described, but people get that a little bit easier than an airship, I guess. But they did, because of the success of an event that we did in 2016, thanks to Noe and Steven. We had a number of other people involved, thanks to Jim Mars, rest in peace. We pulled together enough people to have a successful event that then allowed for them to have the resources to erect a monument, which is really cool. You can still see it, crashed UFO, a spaceship, windmill, and alien, right? So they're playing into the theme. They really like people to support that at the time. Some wild things happened much later, and that affected their ability to, I think, encourage that. A research project of mine has been focusing on Aurora in a way that is to catalog all the ways and to showcase, whether fact, fiction, or folklore, all the ways that this story has been embedded in all multimedia for as long as it's been around. So, I'd love to get with anyone who has any information about that. I've uncovered a ton of things, but there's always more. I'm putting together an online encyclopedic database that will be something that will eventually have a publication to follow. But that's so it can just be made accessible to anyone in the world for free, because I think that's more important. People often throw flack at this idea because I'm trying to capitalize on a hoax. To me, I think that's nonsense. Almost all of social aspects of life are based upon things like in science fiction and contemporary fictional things that we are all about. Look at Marvel movies, look at conventions. Like, most people are into all of that kind of stuff, and none of it's real at all. So it's like, to me, I would allay any concern that I'm trying to utilize this for the purposes of financial gain, just simply to say that, if that's really what people think, I'll just put it all online for free, because I'm more concerned that history is going to continue to be lost the more we have things happen that unfortunately facilitates that, like buildings catching on fire multiple times, the losses of a museum that has some of the last originals that everyone who had in possession no longer has. So the City Hall in Aurora burnt down into 2021, lost all of that. The local Wise County Heritage Museum burned down in 2023, lost everything in there. So now our best efforts are those who have any possible remaining materials or information about the story. Not necessarily to prove that it happened or that it didn't happen, but to show that recording things and documenting material is not really just about trying to prove a certain point of view, but trying to understand the importance of and the historicity of it as inspirational or even as folklore. So that's my current endeavor with Aurora. And we also have events like the Texas UFO Network, Texas UFO Conference, and then the network. You guys can definitely get on board with that. I'd be glad to relay any other information, resources. And of course, there are opportunities to get connected with other events, networking, things that can help us stay interested in whatever's going on and in the know. And again, with the Vortex, you can find out about other interesting phenomena, events, meetings, and resources as well. So with that, I'll conclude this portion of the Texas history for UFOs for now, and then we'll take a short break, and then we'll get back here in just a moment.